The girl didn't hear the commands. She couldn't because she was deaf. But the cops didn't care. Shots echoed, and she fell to the ground. The crowd screamed, and just when the officers thought they'd walk away untouched, black SUVs rolled in. Out stepped her father, with the FBI behind him. The sun was setting, painting the streets in shades of orange and gold, as a 16-year-old girl walked home with her school bag hanging from one shoulder. Her world was quiet, as it always had been. She was deaf, born into silence, but full of life, full of dreams. She often signed words to herself while walking, practicing conversations she wished she could one day have. That evening, 2 police officers sitting in their cruiser spotted her moving slowly across the crosswalk. One frowned, whispering to the other that she looked suspicious. They pulled over, stepped out, and barked commands at her to stop and show her hands. She froze mid-step, her eyes darting in confusion, her hands tightening on her bag. The crowd nearby shouted, "She can't hear you. She's deaf." But the words fell on ears that chose not to listen. The officers exchanged smirks, mistaking her silence for defiance. One tapped his gun as if to intimidate, while the other stepped closer, his voice sharp and cruel, repeating orders that never reached her. She raised her hands slowly, palms trembling, her face pale with fear, still unsure why she was being stopped. The crowd grew louder, desperately trying to intervene, but the officers' arrogance only swelled. They saw a young black girl, powerless and alone, and in their minds that was enough. The street turned eerily quiet despite the voices shouting all around, as though the entire city was holding its breath. And in that terrible silence, the moment before disaster, the girl stood frozen under the weight of authority she did not understand, her innocence colliding with a danger she never invited. What happened next would shatter the night, the crowd, and the illusion that power meant justice. The girl's eyes darted from the angry faces of the officers to the crowd shouting desperately on her behalf. She could not hear their voices, but she could see their mouths moving, their hands waving, their fear written in every gesture. She lifted her trembling fingers to sign, "I don't understand," but the officers only saw movement and mistook it for resistance. One barked louder, veins bulging in his neck, his hand tightening around his weapon. The crowd's cries rose in pitch, a dozen voices pleading, "She's deaf. She can't hear you." But arrogance drowned out truth. The girl took one small step back, her chest heaving, eyes wide with panic. In that single motion, the officer drew his gun. Time seemed to stop. The wind paused. The air froze. The world held its breath. Then the sound ripped through the silence. A gunshot. A scream tore from the crowd as her body jerked and collapsed onto the pavement, her school bag spilling books across the street, pages fluttering like broken wings. For a moment, there was chaos. People running, some recording, others kneeling beside her with tears streaming. Blood stained the concrete, her hands twitching weakly, signing in broken fragments of fear and pain. The officers stood unmoved, their faces hardened, muttering to one another as if nothing had happened. But around them, outrage was brewing like a storm, the crowd shouting murderers. Sirens wailed in the distance, but the sound that froze the officers was not of police backup. It was the black SUVs that tore through the barricades with precision, engines roaring like thunder. The doors flung open and out stepped men in dark suits, their badges flashing under the streetlights, their eyes sharp and unflinching. At the center of them all was a tall man, his jaw clenched, his stride commanding. The crowd parted instantly, whispers rippling through like a wave. "FBI." The man dropped to his knees beside the fallen girl, cradling her face with trembling hands, his eyes wet with grief but burning with fire. "Baby girl, Daddy's here," he whispered, his voice breaking, though his daughter could not hear. He kissed her forehead gently, then rose slowly, his towering frame casting a shadow over the stunned officers. His suit jacket shifted, revealing his badge, the golden letters gleaming with authority that silenced the entire street. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The officers who had laughed moments before now shifted nervously, their hands twitching, their arrogance cracking under the weight of his stare. The man's voice cut through the chaos, low and steady, yet sharp as steel. "You shot my daughter," he said, every word dripping with controlled fury. A deaf child, unarmed, innocent. The crowd erupted behind him, chanting, roaring with the strength of a rising storm. But he lifted his hand and silence returned. His gaze locked on the officers, and he pointed to them one by one, his tone final, merciless. "You thought she was powerless. Tonight you end your careers. You end your impunity. And you answer to me." The crowd's cries grew louder as cameras flashed, capturing every trembling face of the officers who had once smirked with superiority. The FBI agents spread out like a wall of iron, their presence heavy, their eyes sharp, leaving no room for escape. The father stood tall at the center, his hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder as paramedics worked to stabilize her. His voice thundered, not with anger alone, but with the authority of a man who had spent decades holding others accountable. "These men will not walk away," he declared, his words echoing through the air like a gavel. He signaled to his team, and in an instant, the agents moved, snatching badges, snapping handcuffs around wrists that had once wielded power recklessly. The officers who had once barked commands now stood shackled, their pride stripped bare before the community they had terrorized. Phones streamed the moment live across the nation, hashtags exploding, the world watching in real time as the system began to shake. Mothers clutched their children tighter, young men lifted their fists in unity, and elders whispered that finally, justice had a voice. The girl, weak but awake, opened her eyes and saw her father standing like a fortress, unbreakable. She could not hear the chants that rose for her, but she could see the tears, the fists, the trembling smiles of hope. Her hand reached up to grasp her father's fingers, and for the first time that night, he allowed his tears to fall freely. Justice had been set in motion. Not tomorrow, not after excuses, but here, tonight. The world was watching, and the men who had believed themselves untouchable were about to be erased by the very law they had mocked. Weeks later, the courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people who had followed the story from the night it happened. Reporters lined the back, pens scratching and cameras flashing. But the most powerful presence in the room was the silence of a community holding its breath. The racist cops, once arrogant and untouchable, now sat in chains, their uniforms replaced by prison jumpsuits. Their eyes darted nervously, searching for escape but finding none. At the front, the deaf black girl sat with her father, her hands folded tightly, her presence a reminder of the wound they had inflicted but could never erase. When her father stood to speak, the weight of his voice carried across the chamber. Justice isn't revenge. Justice is accountability. And tonight, accountability will be written into history. The judge's gavel slammed, the verdict delivered, guilty on all charges. The crowd erupted, some crying, some cheering, but all knowing this was more than a trial. It was a turning point. The girl looked at her father, her eyes glistening, and though she could not hear the roar around her, she felt the vibration of unity, of voices rising for her. She lifted her hand in silent strength, and the crowd responded with raised fists, a gesture of power that transcended sound. The disgraced officers were led away, their careers, their power, their arrogance shattered. For the first time in years, the community felt the grip of fear loosen, replaced by the fire of hope. Outside, under the setting sun, the father hugged his daughter tightly. "You are not voiceless," he whispered into her hair, knowing she could not hear but believing she could feel every word. And as the crowd surged around them chanting her name, the truth was undeniable. Her silence had become the loudest voice of all. If this story moved you, show your support by liking, commenting, and sharing it with others. Subscribe to Unheard Heroes for more powerful stories that honor courage and truth.